Satan, you are subject to my judgment. You are a destroyer. You are a murderer. You leave. You lose your power. Leave this country. I demand that you be judged." After a stunning trial that revealed decades of financial deception and tax evasion, Kenneth Copeland, one of America's wealthiest and most notorious televangelists, was sentenced to life in prison today. As Judge Martin Reynolds handed down the maximum penalty, the 87-year-old founder of Kenneth Copeland Ministries remained emotionless, so bringing an end to the preacher's empire that once stretched across continents and attracted millions of followers worldwide. 3 years ago, a former financial manager at Kenneth Copeland Ministries came forward as a whistleblower, giving federal investigators thousands of documents that described what prosecutors described as the biggest religious fraud scheme in American history. This marked the beginning of the case against Copeland. Before departing the ministry in 2020, Michael Thornton, who had been the deputy financial controller for 14 years, surreptitiously copied internal communications, offshore account information, and financial data. "I was no longer able to participate." During the trial, Thornton provided testimony, observing people give their last dollars as Mr. Copeland purchased yet another plane or piece of real estate with their sacrifice donations. "I knew God was asking me to reveal the truth at all costs, and it shattered my heart." The IRS, FBI, and Department of Justice's subsequent investigation revealed proof that Copeland had personally embezzled more than $150 million in church donations to support his extravagant lifestyle, which included a fleet of private planes, many houses, and high-end cars. Despite telling supporters that their money was going toward humanitarian and missionary endeavors, Copeland spent $17.5 million on private planes in a single year, according to bank records. In order to conceal assets from the IRS, Copeland established a complex web of offshore accounts and dummy corporations, as the prosecution proved. In order to hide the money flow, the ministry set up over 30 distinct organizations in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Liechtenstein, none of which had any valid religious purpose. The evidence that he had directed employees to fabricate ministry spending and donation records in order to preserve the organization's tax-exempt status was the most damning. While keeping his personal bank account at the government, the defendant did more than simply conflate personal usage with ministry funding. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Wilson informed the jury that he completely destroyed it. Mr. Copeland's bank accounts were the ministry's bank accounts. The gospel wasn't preached with donor money. They traveled to disperse his empire. During the trial, the Fort Worth, Texas courtroom was crowded with erstwhile supporters. Following Copeland's assurances that God would increase their gifts, many of them had contributed large amounts of their life savings to his ministry. During the 7-week trial, some attendees sobbed aloud as details of the fraud were revealed, especially when prosecutors showed videos of Copeland using ministry-funded private jets to fly between his many properties and solicit seed faith donations from followers who were in financial need. One video from 2018 showed Copeland telling viewers, "The Lord said to me, tell my people to give their best offering ever, and I will cancel their debts." Immediately following this broadcast, the ministry received over $20 million in donations, of which prosecutors proved $6 million went directly to purchasing a waterfront property in Florida under a shell company controlled by Copeland family members. The defendant preyed upon the faith and trust of thousands of sincere believers, said U.S. Attorney Caroline Marchand during her closing arguments. He exploited their religious devotion for personal gain while claiming divine approval for his actions. This case isn't about religious freedom. It's about fraud, plain and simple. Copeland's defense team, led by high-profile attorney James Morrison, had attempted to portray the case as government persecution of religious organizations. They argued that the luxurious lifestyle was necessary for Copeland's worldwide ministry, and that donors understood their contributions would support his work, including his travel needs. The prosperity gospel that Mr. Copeland preaches includes the belief that God rewards faithfulness with material blessings, Morrison told the court. His lifestyle was a testament to the very principles he espoused, and his followers understood this. These weren't secrets. The jets and properties were visible symbols of the success of his ministry and the truth of his teachings. This defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented recorded conversations between Copeland and his financial advisors, discussing how to shield the jets from government busybodies and keep the real numbers away from the sheep, referring to his followers. In one particularly damning recording from 2017, Copeland could be heard laughing about a widow who donated her insurance payout, saying, "She thinks she's getting a heavenly return, but the only return is my new hangar." The prosecution also introduced internal emails directing staff to create fake mission projects for fundraising campaigns that had no actual operations. One email from Copeland to his son, John, instructed him to create some pictures of those African children we supposedly helped for a fundraising broadcast. Perhaps most devastating to the defense was testimony from former ministry insiders who described a culture of fear and secrecy within the organization. Sarah Williams, who worked as Copeland's personal assistant for 8 years, testified that staff were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and were threatened with both legal action and divine punishment if they questioned financial practices. He told us that questioning his spending was questioning God himself, Williams testified. He said anyone who exposed ministry business would face God's wrath. We were all terrified not just of losing our jobs, but of eternal damnation. Williams described how staff members who raised concerns about financial irregularities were immediately terminated and branded as influenced by demonic forces. Former employees were often subjected to public condemnation during service broadcasts, with Copeland telling his audience that these individuals had aligned themselves with Satan to attack God's work. The prosecution also presented evidence that Copeland had knowingly solicited donations for disaster relief efforts and missionary work that were instead diverted to business ventures and property acquisitions. Bank records showed that less than 3% of funds raised for Hurricane Katrina victims ever reached relief organizations, while millions went to a real estate investment company owned by the Copeland family that purchased distressed properties in the affected areas. David Martinez, former director of international missions for the ministry, testified that he was instructed to create fictional reports about missionary activities that never occurred. I was told to write detailed reports about schools and hospitals we had supposedly built in developing countries, Martinez said. In reality, those projects didn't exist. When I expressed concern, Mr. Copeland told me, the donors need to feel good about giving. The details don't matter. The trial took an unexpected turn when Eagle Mountain International Church, the legal name for Copeland's primary ministry organization, attempted to distance itself from Copeland's church. Board members filed a motion claiming they had been unaware of the financial improprieties and should not be held liable for Copeland's individual actions. This move backfired when prosecutors produced board meeting minutes showing the members had repeatedly approved transactions moving funds from ministry accounts to Copeland's personal control. Further investigation revealed that board members had received significant personal benefits, including luxury vehicles, all-expense-paid vacations classified as ministry retreats, and housing allowances despite not having official ministerial duties. As the guilty verdict was read last week, Copeland remained stoic, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorneys. His wife Gloria and other family members, who have been conspicuously absent from most of the proceedings, were not present for the verdict or today's sentencing. Sources close to the family indicated that significant tension had developed as various members sought to protect their own interests. During today's sentencing hearing, Judge Reynolds allowed impact statements from several former followers. Mary Thompson, a 76-year-old widow from Oklahoma, described how she donated her entire retirement savings of $340,000 to Copeland's ministry after her husband's death. Mr. Copeland promised me that if I showed my faith through giving, God would restore it many times over. And Thompson told the court, her voice breaking. He said it was fear and lack of faith to keep money in savings when it could be planted as seed. Now I live with my daughter because I can't afford housing. While he flew in private jets, I lost everything. Robert Castillo, a former ministry partner from Houston, described how his family donated more than $800,000 over 15 years, much of it borrowed against their home and business, believing they were supporting international mission work. We remortgaged everything we had because Mr. Copeland told us God would bring a 100-fold return. Instead, we lost our business, our home, and nearly our marriage, Castillo said. The worst part wasn't the financial loss, but the spiritual devastation of realizing we'd been deceived by someone we trusted as a man of God. Perhaps the most emotional testimony came from Janet Williams. No relation to Sarah Williams, who described how her late husband had refused potentially life-saving cancer treatment in favor of faith healing promoted by Copeland's ministry. My husband declined medical treatment and instead sent $25,000 to the ministry's healing school. She testified, Mr. Copeland personally told him that seeking medical treatment showed a lack of faith that would prevent his healing. He died believing he hadn't been faithful enough. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Copeland surprised many by declining to express remorse. Instead, He quoted scripture and maintained that his ministry had helped millions of people worldwide. "The Lord knows my heart," Copeland said, standing straight despite his age. "This ministry has brought salvation and healing to countless souls across the globe. Man may judge, but God's judgment is what matters. Like the Apostle Paul, I am persecuted for preaching prosperity, but I have kept the faith. I regret nothing because my conscience is clear before God Almighty." Judge Reynolds was unmoved by this response. In delivering the life sentence, he criticized Copeland's extraordinary lack of remorse and the calculated nature of these crimes over decades. "You systematically exploited faith for financial gain," Reynolds stated, his voice stern. "The court cannot ignore the magnitude of this fraud or the vulnerability of the victims who trusted you as a spiritual leader. This sentence reflects not only the financial harm you've caused, but the spiritual damage to those who trusted you." Reynolds continued, "The court ordered the forfeiture of assets worth approximately $240 million, including Copeland's 1,500-acre lakefront property near Fort Worth, his fleet of aircraft including a Gulfstream 5 and Citation X, and numerous real estate holdings across Texas, Colorado, Florida, and California." The judge also ordered restitution to identified victims, though prosecutors acknowledged that recovering funds for all affected donors would be impossible given the decades-long scope of the fraud. The sentencing included a separate judgment against Eagle Mountain International Church as an organization, with the court appointing a receiver to manage its assets and determine which could be liquidated for victim compensation. The ruling specifically protected legitimate religious functions while separating them from the vast commercial empire built through fraudulent means. As Copeland was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, reactions among spectators were mixed. Some former followers appeared vindicated, while others seemed stunned that the man they had revered for decades would spend the rest of his life behind bars. "I never thought I'd see this day," said Thomas Richardson, a former ministry donor who had traveled from California for the sentencing. "For years, questioning Kenneth Copeland was like questioning God himself in our community. The manipulation was so complete that even seeing the evidence, some people still can't accept the truth." Outside the courthouse, hundreds of supporters gathered with signs proclaiming Copeland's innocence and claiming religious persecution. Many cited Bible verses about persecution and prophesied divine intervention to free Copeland. Some held signs reading, "Touch not God's anointed and free God's prophet." Diane Reynolds, who identified herself as a 30-year follower of Copeland's ministry, told reporters, "This is spiritual warfare, plain and simple. The government is persecuting a man of God because they fear his message. Brother Copeland helped millions find faith and prosperity. These charges are Satan's attempt to stop the gospel." A smaller group of former followers celebrated the verdict, with some describing the relief of seeing accountability for what they called decades of spiritual abuse and financial exploitation. Several former members had formed support groups during the trial process, finding healing and shared experiences after years of what many described as religious trauma. As for Copeland himself, at 87, the life sentence effectively ensures he will spend his remaining years in federal prison. He has been designated to serve his term at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, a facility for inmates requiring specialized medical care, keeping him near the empire he built and lost. The psychological impact on his followers remains one of the most profound aspects of the case. Dr. John Lavish, a sociologist specializing in cults and high-control groups, explained, "Support groups for former followers have emerged across the country, many led by licensed therapists specializing in religious trauma. These groups report being overwhelmed with people seeking help processing their experiences and rebuilding their faith or establishing new belief systems. I lost 30 years of my life and thousands of dollars to this ministry," said Emily Cartwright, who now leads a support group in Dallas. "But the worst loss was my authentic relationship with God, which was replaced with fear, performance, and financial exploitation. Many of us are having to completely rebuild our spiritual lives from scratch." The broader prosperity gospel movement, which teaches that God rewards increased faith and donations with material blessing, appears to be undergoing a reformation in the wake of the scandal. Several prominent prosperity preachers have modified their messages, placing greater emphasis on spiritual growth and responsible stewardship rather than material wealth. Copeland's attorneys have already announced plans to appeal, claiming procedural errors and constitutional overreach. Lead attorney James Morrison told reporters outside the courthouse, "Mr. Copeland operated a ministry according to his sincerely held religious beliefs about prosperity. Legal experts note that the overwhelming evidence and comprehensive financial documentation make a successful appeal unlikely. Prosecution was careful to focus solely on financial crimes rather than questioning religious doctrines, and Judge Reynolds repeatedly instructed the jury to consider only the financial evidence, not Copeland's theological positions. For the thousands of followers who once viewed Kenneth Copeland as a divinely appointed messenger, today's sentence marks the end of an era and the beginning of a painful reckoning with decades of misplaced trust. Many former donors expressed a complex mix of emotions: relief at seeing justice served, anger at having been deceived, and grief over the spiritual manipulation they experienced. "I believed in him completely," said Margaret Wilson, a former donor from Arkansas. "I sent money I couldn't afford because I truly believed God would honor that seed and multiply it. Today, I feel both vindicated and heartbroken." How do you rebuild faith after something like this? As Copeland begins his sentence, the empire he built over 6 decades lies in ruins, its assets frozen or being liquidated to compensate victims. The private jets that became symbols of his success are being sold. The sprawling ministry headquarters stands half empty, and the television broadcasts that reached millions have gone dark. Yet perhaps the most significant impact of this case will be on the invisible landscape of faith and trust. For many, Copeland represented not just a religious leader, but a direct channel to divine blessing. His conviction forces a reevaluation not just of one man's ministry, of an entire theological system that promised material rewards for spiritual devotion. In his final statement to the court before being led away, Copeland remained defiant. But what is certain is that the legacy of Kenneth Copeland has been forever altered by today's historic sentence.